Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. We've made it through another week, and we're on Masterclass number 50. We've hit a big milestone, halfway to 100. I do have a feeling we will get there one day. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. If you're on Twitter, hello Twitter people. I don't know if there's names for Twitter people, but hello. No chat over there, but if you do want to chat along, head on over to behance.net/Adobe Live. We've got Cody and Umacorn and Masayu and Kaltrina and Svetlin. If I mispronounce your name, I do apologize. Wade and Ruth, and who else do we have in here? Tatiana, great to see all of you. Ankita, Anita, Moat of Void. That's a great username. Great to see you. All right. So, like I mentioned, Masterclass number 50 is upon us. So I'm going to hop over to my screen, and we are going to get started. So, today we're going to be starting the process of building out a messaging app. You know, you're all familiar with Facebook Messenger, Slack, Microsoft Teams. There's a slew of different apps, and we can go in so many different directions with these apps. So earlier today, I posted this on Dribbble. If you're not following me, definitely go ahead and follow me on Dribbble. This is essentially what we're going to be creating. We're not going to finish this in one episode. It might take 2 or 3, depends on how deep we want to get. And afterwards, I'm going to create a more polished video series on how to create various elements inside of this project. I also posted on Twitter a little video showing kind of what we're going to be going through today, you know, using assets to bring them in to XD, and then using things like stacks and padding and all this fun stuff to make your process that much simpler. All right. Let me hop over to Adobe XD, and Svetlin is saying, after watching 40 episodes on YouTube for the past 3 weeks, finally tuning in live for the first time. Thank you. I appreciate it. You watched 40 episodes. You binged watch, like I binge watch on Netflix, but I appreciate you binge watching the masterclasses and a lot more to come. So we got people from India, people from all over the United States, people from Canada. Great to see all of you. Alrighty, so here we are in Adobe XD, and we are going to get going with a nice large artboard. You know, primarily this is going to be used for either a desktop or a web experience. So we're going to focus right in this area here, right? 1920 by 1080. Of course, you can start bigger, you can start smaller. There are some presets here, but we're going to start with 1920 by 1080, and this will allow us to really, you know, make sure it's perfect for the web or desktop, which is typically viewed at a 16 by 9 ratio. All right, so here we go. We're going to start off Messenger, and I'm going to just name this Messenger Lite, because eventually, maybe next week or the week after, we're going to adapt this into a more dark mode version. All right, so I've got this nice white artboard. Now, what I'm thinking, if we take a very quick look at the example, in the background, I have this very colorful image, and that allows me to utilize things like background blurs. And by the way, if anyone has questions about XD as I go through this stream, definitely throw them in the chat. I am taking a peek from time to time. All right, so what I want to do is add in a nice background image to this artboard. So I'm going to grab the good old rectangle tool, shortcut key R, drag one out just like this, and then I'm going to hop over to Finder. And I've got some great images here that I've been grabbing from Adobe stock, including this one. This is just beautiful, colorful, blue and orange and pinks and purples. Drag this directly into the shape. Boop, there we go. And this will allow me to pull in some of that background as I'm designing. You know, most of this is going to be covered up, but in the menu on the side and some other elements, we might want to pull some of that color in. So we've got that in place, and now we're going to start the process over here on the left, and we're going to create the panel that's going to house the users you've been chatting with or your frequently used or messaged users. So I'm going to grab the rectangle one more time and drag one out. Right about there. We can always adjust the sizing a little bit later. Perfect. Okay. Now, I talked about background blur, and if you've watched my master classes before, you know I love background blurs, right? Cody says, ooh, such a fun background. I agree, Adobe Stock has some great stuff. Of course, you can make something like this yourself in Illustrator, even XD, but I'm lazy sometimes. I like grabbing some images from Adobe stock. So what I want to do is actually, before I get to the background blur, because there's a point I want to emphasize with this, let's create our first user. So with the rectangle one more time, I'm going to drag one out. Now this might be too big, it might be too small. We will definitely see how things go, but I'm going to leave it somewhere in this area here, maybe 80 pixels. And you can see that over here to the, to the right in the properties inspector. Make sure it's centered. And I might want to round out the corners just a little bit, or a lot, depends on your style, right? Let's go for 16 pixels. You can also enter that to the right as well. And let's go for, we may want a border, but not necessarily this kind of border, and you'll see why in a moment. So we have this right here, right? Now, there are many ways to add in additional users to this particular section. We may want, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 users going down this panel. Now, of course, we can use our repeat grid right here at the top. We can go ahead and press repeat grid, boop, and then drag out some additional ones. Now, this certainly has some advantages, right? This is obviously one of the biggest advantages, very quickly being able to drag out additional users. Another cool advantage is if you do have assets that you want to bring in this case, maybe users, right? I can go to my Toy Faces library. Cody will post a link to Toy Faces in the chat. And I can just grab some images and drag them directly in. You can do the same thing with images from Finder or Explorer on Windows. So a lot of really cool advantages of using a repeat grid. There's also the option of using a stack. And I kind of like using stacks sometimes more than a repeat grid because it gives you some extra flexibility on rearranging your objects and spacing them out, right? So what we're going to do here is before I add in some additional ones, I may want, like I mentioned, a border behind this. I'm going to name this user. And behind this, I'm going to duplicate the shape. Command and Control D very quickly. And I'm going to enlarge it, and I can move it behind. I'm going to call this border. Let's make sure that's a capital B, just so I don't go insane. There we go. Now, I'm going to change the color so we can see what this border is looking like. Now, what you're going to notice, and this is very important if you're designing with rounded rectangles or rounded squares or whatever you're designing with, right? The shape in the front, which is going to be used as the user profile, and the shape in the back, which we're going to be using for a stylized border, the corner radius is identical, right? 16 pixels. And Aubrey's saying, can't stay, but had to jump to, oh, thank you for the congratulations on 50 episodes. I will see you next time, Aubrey. All right, so both of these shapes have a coordinate radius of 16 pixels. So you would think that it would look pretty good. But if you take a look, especially if you look at the preview, right over here, it doesn't look accurate. And I've talked about this before. And that's because when you enlarge the shape in the background or you shrink the shape in the foreground, the corner radius, even though they're the same number and the value, it looks a little bit off. So what you'll want to do is select either of them and just use the handles. And in this case, I'm selecting the one in the background and just bringing it on in just a little bit. So visually, it's going to look a little bit more, seamless, right? Again, there we go. So that looks a little bit better, right? And I can make this a little larger if I wanted to. And as I do that, I'll just want to make sure to bring this in again. Something like that, right? So now that we have this border, there are a few ways. Hey, Jan, great to see you. There are a few ways to, style this. One, we might want to start thinking about the stories experience. I know we all love stories, or you hate stories, but you may want to bring in some of that, right? So on stories, you might have certain colors that will be, that will let you know that there's a new story available. So in this case, we might want to go to our fill over here to the right, and I'm going to switch this over to a linear gradient. And maybe the top color, we'll go for a nice, we'll go for a nice pinkish. I'm going to pull it over to the left a little bit to reduce the saturation just a touch. We may want to revisit that at some point, but, the beauty of using assets and components is that you can do that, right? Just like that. That looks pretty good. So we'll keep it there. And this will be the active story. Right? So we have our avatar in the center and we have our border on the outside, which will indicate stories. Now, if you think about the story's experience, there are typically two states, right? There's the active experience where it lets you know that a user has a story that you have not watched. And there is the state where you've already watched it. Or actually, there might be three. And then there's a state where they don't have a story, right? But we'll focus on the first two. So we have our border selected. We're going to turn this into a component. You can do that in the Properties Inspector, Command and Control K, lots of different ways to do that. And we do have it named border. You can also see it right here inside of your assets. Let's just actually name this stories. And now what we want to do, we want to create that additional state so that we can very easily cycle between the two. So I'm going to press that plus button one more time and create a new state. And this will be, let's say, watched, right? Or viewed, whatever you want. And this one, it's more of an inactive state, right? So instead of this bright, vibrant border, we may want to just dial it back and do something like a solid color. We'll set it to white, and then we'll set the blend mode to something like overlay or soft light. Now, obviously, because this shape in the background is white, and we set this to white as well, we're not seeing any change. So let's talk very quickly about that background blur, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to select this background, this container, right? And I'll just name this users container. And what I want to do, just to add a little bit of style to this, is turn on a background blur right here at the bottom of the Properties Inspector. Now, by default, it's going to show you a lot of that background, and it may not blur enough. Now, in this case, the blur is not too bad, but it's a little bit translucent. We want to kind of bring some of that color of the original background back into play. And this will allow us to bring in some additional colors, or at least allow us to see the avatars a little bit better, right? So what we want is down here, you can adjust the amount of blur, you can adjust the brightness, and you can adjust also the effect opacity. So if I take the amount of blur, maybe bump it all the way up to 50, and this is really good, especially if you have things like text over top of this shape. If you were to take this slider and move it all the way down to, let's say, 5, right? It's a nice effect, it certainly is. But if you have elements that you really want your users to be able to pay attention to, it may become distracting. So bumping that up either, 20, 30, sometimes even 50 might look pretty nice, right? And then the brightness, we may want to keep it around 0. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, doesn't that defeat the purpose of what you were just talking about? It does. However, we have this effect opacity slider right down to the bottom. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the fill color, which in this case is pure white. Of course, it could be black, it could be red, it could be whatever color you want. And it's going to start to bring that back in as we increase it. So as I bump this up, you're going to notice the white is coming back in. And this will help us achieve a very subtle background blur, right? And of course, you can play with this. You can reduce it a little bit. You can also play around with the brightness if you want to, but I found that setting the brightness at 0 and then bringing some of the original color back in, that way if you do switch it over to black, or if you decide to go light but add a little bit of blue in there, right? It's starting to bring that back in, so you can keep some of that color in there. So we'll stick with 80%. But now you can see that we have our border now visible, right? That's checking for questions, looks pretty good, all right. Then of course we can experiment with maybe instead of overlay, we might want to go soft light just to make it a little bit more subtle. But in this case, we do want our stories experience in this section here, right? All right, so now for the avatar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my Toy Faces library, and I have my own toy face. I'm going to drag it directly in. Look at that. There's me. And of course, from here, you can also add a border to this shape as well if you want to add a little bit more separation. And that looks pretty fancy, right? All right, so we now have our one user in place. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there are many ways to add additional users. Repeat grid, stacks, repeat grid and then stacks, right? So at the moment, repeat grids doesn't work just like stacks. So one thing you can absolutely do is select both of these objects inside of your layers panel, repeat grid, boop. There we go. There's the animation. And then we can drag out some additional ones. So let's go for I don't know, we'll go for, how many is that? Oh, that might be too many. We'll do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Now, I'm gonna go ahead and call this users. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the cool benefits of repeat grids is you can very easily drag in additional images. So I have my avatar selected. Let's go ahead and select a few more. We've got this guy here. We've got 1, 2, 3, I think. And let's say 4. How many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. And there we go. So I'm going to drag all of these directly into any of these cells and bam, there we go, right? So we have that set up. Now, one of the cool things about using repeat grids and components is you probably remember earlier in this area here, this stories experience, right? I converted the border into a component and it has different states. And that will allow me to dive into any of these. Let's say these stories at the bottom, maybe these ones have already been watched. I can very easily just turn that off, right? Or I can dive in here. Let's see. Oh yeah, I have to dive in and make the change to that component without switching the state. Now, of course, that brings up another benefit of using stacks versus repeat grids, because XD is doing what it should be doing, right? It is updating the styling across all the repeat grid cells. So if I were to dive in here, right, and change the border of, let me actually unlink this, right, and change the border, it's going to push that change across. But what I like to do, because I like to have a little bit more control over the users, where they're positioned, is once all the avatars have been dragged in, just ungroup them, right? Ungroup the grid, and then I'm going to pop them into a regular group, Command and Control G, and call this users. All right. Someone's asking, can you put multiple pics in a stack the same way you can with a repeat grid? You cannot, which is why sometimes I do like using the repeat grid to add elements or data, even with plain text documents, and then ungroup it and then convert it into a stack so you have a little bit more functionality. Maybe one day we'll have the two worlds combine a little bit, but who knows? I would like to see that. So now that I have the users in a regular group versus a repeat grid, over within the Properties Inspector, I'm going to turn on a stack, which is going to automatically define that stack based on the layout of those objects. So in this case, XD recognized that the objects are going top to bottom, so it gave me a vertical stack. And I can still, just like a repeat grid, I can still adjust the spacing in between these elements, either all at once. So if I dive in here, I can hold down my Shift key, and I can adjust like this. Let's go for 24. Or in some cases, you may want one or two of the objects to be a little bit more spaced out. So if you let go of your Shift key, you can just drag one like that, right? Another benefit is that I can just start rearranging some of these. And as I do, they rearrange really nicely, right? And I can dive in here, switch this over to the watch state. Maybe this one over here, we'll switch this over to watched. And this one over here. Whoops. And then this one here as well. Perfect. And of course, if you wanted to add additional users, I can just dive in here, Command and Control D to duplicate, and it's going to automatically add that one right below. Now, what we may want to do is we may want right down here, instead of an avatar, maybe an add button to add additional users, maybe to search your directory or whatever it might be that you might want to do. So I'm going to, let's actually set this to the watched state. And this one in the middle, we may want maybe just a solid color. So let's go for a nice greenish blue, something in that area here. And then right in the middle, we may just want a plus button, just to let you people know that hitting this will allow you to add something, right? So with the line tool, I'm going to drag one out. Let's round out the corners, or the caps, I should say. Thicken this up a touch. And then duplicate, Command and Control D, and then right over here to the right, I can flip it. There we go. Not too bad. Not the greatest looking thing in the world, but it should do. All right. So we now have our users looking pretty good. We've got our avatars, we have our stories experience, and then finally right down here at the bottom, we may want one more item, maybe to access our settings, right? So I'm going to actually duplicate this one more time. And then here we might want a very subtle button. So maybe I might want to delete this completely. Maybe I'll change this to a darker color. And then for the icon in the middle, we could use something like a gear icon. We could use sliders, for example. So if you don't have icons, I do have my Nucleo application loaded up, and I can look up something like sliders. Oops, helps if I spell it right. Right? So we have something like this, which we're likely going to use. But if you don't have icons at your disposal, you can head into the plugins panel at the bottom left-hand corner, and you can hit the plus button right at the top, and you can search for a plugin like Icons for Design. And this will allow you to look up something like sliders, right? So we have some here, or settings, gear icons, so on and so forth. So a lot of open source icons that you have access to. I'm gonna hop back over to Nucleo, and let's grab, this icon looks pretty good. Pretty simple, right? Pop that in there. They're pretty large vector-based icons. So I'll drag this down. Take a look at the preview. It's looking a little large, right? These icons at the bottom, especially the plus button and the settings icon, looking a touch large. And possibly even all the other ones are looking a little bit big, but we can always make some changes. Now I may want to bring this down a touch, right? So this one, let me actually drag out a guide. I may want to do the same thing for this icon here. Maybe I'll delete the stories experience in the background. Move the border to the outside just so I can drop the opacity a little bit. There we go. It doesn't look great, but you know what? We'll leave it at this. And then this goes back to what I was talking about stacks, right? Being able to adjust the spacing all at once or individually. So I can just move this downwards. So the spacing maintains up here. So if I duplicate another one, it's going to maintain that 24 pixel spacing. But the one down here at the bottom, it's kind of floating down there, right? That's looking okay. Still not great. I'm still not loving it, but it could do, right? Let's see, do I want a border here? Yeah, I probably do, right? All right, these are small things that we can go back and tweak later on, but liking it. Now, what I will mention is, we have this stories experience border back here, and I may want to make changes to all of these other ones. Maybe I want to drop the opacity a little bit or change the pink to a blue or something to that extent. And there are a few ways to do this, right? Now I have this one selected, and you're going to notice that at the top left-hand corner, there is a hollow diamond. And this indicates that this is an instance of the main component. So if I want to make changes to all of the default states inside of this stories experience component, I'll have to edit the main component. So if I were to edit this one here, right, it's not pushing the changes to any of the other ones. So I would right click, edit main component. It's going to bring out that main component, which, by the way, you might think, well, wasn't that main component included in the original design when you converted it into a repeat grid? The answer is yes, absolutely. But when I converted it into a repeat grid, it converted that main component into an instance so that you can dive in and make some overrides, right? So I now have my main component right here, which is the one at the solid diamond. And now let's say I might want to dive in and maybe drop the opacity a little bit or experiment with some of the blend modes. Overlay might be a little bit too subtle. Yeah, those are probably too subtle, right? That's not too bad. But I think for the most part, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to just pull this over to the left a little bit, just so it's a little bit more on the pastel side. There we go. All right. So our users are more or less complete, but there might be one more thing we might want to add, and that's a hover effect. So that when we're hovering over any of these users, it'll allow us to see the name of that user. So let's go ahead and dive into this one here. Now, what I don't want to do is I don't want to convert this into a component, especially if I'm using this in a repeat grid, because that will break some of the functionality. So what I typically like to do is create a separate element to use as a component for some of my hover effects, right? So I'm going to duplicate this shape because I do like that size. And we're going to change this to hover. And I'm not too concerned about what is inside the shape, right? So I'm going to turn off the fill, turn off the border, or at least set the fill to a color where I can see it. And then over top of it, we may want a very small call out. So I'm going to grab the rectangle, draw one out like this. I might want to round out the corners a little bit. Let's try 4 pixels. Very subtle, but nice. And then right below, we may want a very small polygon pointing downwards towards that user. So with the polygon tool, shortcut key Y, I'm going to drag one out. Maybe I'll flip it. And I'll also round out the corners ever so slightly on this polygon just by pulling on this handle, or I can do it in the Properties Inspector. And then with both of these objects selected, I'm going to hold down my Shift key and select. Right here at the top, I can go ahead and hit the Add button to add it to a Boolean object, right? There we go. Let's take a quick peek. It's a little bit too large, so I'm going to pull that down, pull that inwards a little bit. And then I might, because everything else is very light and white, for this one, is this continuing Animal Crossing app? It is not. So we're designing a messenger app, kind of like Facebook Messenger or Slack or the million others that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And maybe I will set this one to a darker color, just to differentiate it from everything else. And depending on what's behind it, I may want to consider a background blur, but in this case, we may not need one. We can always just drop the opacity just a little bit. There we go. All right. I do see a more complicating question about scroll groups, I believe. Shoot me a tweet. I'll take a look at that. I do want to make sure to get through as much as I can during this particular stream. And then on the inside, this one is going to be me, so I'm going to go ahead and type that. All right. Now, in terms of the typeface, sometimes you start defining those typefaces and fonts a little bit later on, but in this case, I want to start with it's the new Cabal or new Cabal or new Cabell. Not sure how to pronounce it, but it's a nice typeface I've been using lately, and it has some nice elements to it. I'm going to switch it over to maybe book and change this to white. There we go. And there's me. Or maybe I might want to bump it to medium, possibly. All right, perfect. Now, one more thing we might want to add for this particular element is we might want to pop it into a group and enable padding, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the name, which is right here, and I'm going to select this element here, which is our Boolean object. I'm going to select both of them, put them into a group, Command and Control G, and I'm going to call this, let's say, callout. And then over within the Properties Inspector, the same place where we were able to enable a stack last time, we can now turn on padding, which is going to look at the layer in the background, which could be a Boolean object, a mask, a shape, whatever it might be, right? And the objects above it. And it's going to define the padding based on that. So what I'm going to do is I can define the padding more if I wanted to here, but if I dive in here and just change this to, let's say, I saw Jan in there, Jan, it's going to automatically resize. Now, what you might be noticing is this element here got a little bit skinnier, right? So I'm going to dive in here and I'm going to select this. I'm going to turn on manual overrides and just make sure that fixed width is turned on. Someone's saying this should be more of a UI design masterclass than XD masterclass. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but we're kind of teaching both. It's going over UI and Adobe XD. So now that I have that, if I type out Jan, that little bit down at the bottom remains the same width, which is great. So you have those manual overrides if you need them. All right, so we have our call out and we have our hover target area. And what we want to do now is turn this into a component. So I'm going to select both of these elements, the hover target and also the call out, and turn it into a component, Command and Control K, which is going to pop it right over here. Let me go ahead and name this user, let's say username. And then for the default state, we actually don't want any of this to be visible. So we have our default state set up. I'm going to dive in here. I'm simply going to hide this and grab this and reduce the opacity. I'm not going to hide it completely, because if I hide it completely, it's going to remove that target that we created, right? So I'm just going to drop the opacity to 0. So it's still there, but it's also not still there, right? And then we're going to go back in here and we're going to create an additional state, but we want to create a hover state. And the nice thing about hover states is it's going to be automatically wired up by default. And you can tell that's the case by the lightning icon over to the right. And now I can dive in and reveal the callout, just like that, right? So we have our default state and our hover state. And if we press play, we can hover and see my name, right? Now, because auto animate is the default for hover states, there's really, in this case, there's nothing to animate, right? There's a little bit of a dissolve, right? So if I go into prototype mode, I do have my hover interaction selected. I'm simply going to switch this from auto animate to transition with no animation. That way, the hover kicks off immediately. And this will be really nice once I get these ones wired up, right? I can just kind of go down and all of them will kick off right away. So now that this one is set up and looking pretty good, I can dive into these other ones, right? And I can just drag this inwards if I wanted to. I can switch over to the hover state just so I can see, right? And I'll want to make sure that the layers are on top. We'll get to that later. But of course, one thing that you probably should have done, or I should have done in this case, is created that hover state first and then duplicated all these users downwards, either in a repeat grid or in a stack, right? So just things to think about as you're designing. All right, so that's looking pretty good, and we will get back to more of the users in a little bit, but I do want to move on to an additional section over here to the right, which might display your list of messages. And this is also going to touch on stacks and padding. So right over here, let me first group these together, call this users, and then I'm going to grab the rectangle one more time, drag out another container right in this area here. And then for this one, we might want to introduce a little bit of color. So instead of this pure white, we're going to go to the blues and just bring in a little bit of blue in here, right? Just a touch. We don't want to go too much, just a little bit, right? And then possibly, we may want to also round out the corners at the top left and the bottom left as well, right? So if you were to grab this handle here and drag this in, all the corners are going to round, right? But if you just want one or two of the corners rounded, you can do that inside of your properties inspector. I'm going to turn on this option here, and then I want the top left, let's say 32, and then the bottom left, which is the one at the far end, 32 as well, right? And now we have nice rounded corners. But of course, you're noticing that you can see a little bit of the background. So in this case, all I would do is just dive in here, grab this container, and just move it on inwards a little bit, just so it covers up that area, right? And if you want to get really fancy, completely optional, but you can also add a very slight shadow. So I have a shadow turned on this container, and I'm going to drop the x-axis so it pushes it over to the left. And the y-axis we can keep at 0. I am going to blur it quite a bit, so it's nice and subtle. We'll start with 16, we'll see what that looks like. But for the color, I'm also going to introduce a little bit of blue in there. Very subtle again, right? Just like that. And then we might want to maybe experiment, maybe bump this up to about 32. Again, so it's nice and subtle. There we go. All right. So for this container, we may want a header to let users know what exactly it is that they are looking at. So I'm going to actually duplicate this container, Command and Control D, just so I have that shape in place, and bring it on up. And this one we might want to introduce a little bit more of colors, right? So I'm going to maybe add a little bit of pink in there, something like that. Now, the shape at the moment, because we duplicated it, has a rounded corner at the bottom left-hand corner, which we may not necessarily want in this case. So I'm going to hold down my Alt or Option key and drag that on in. All right. Someone's asking, we're working on a medical website and using stock image source for doctors. Is it legal to use those if I have a subscription? So you might be talking about things like Adobe Stock or any other stock image website. If you have legally licensed those images, you should be able to use it, depending on what you're doing, right? So some websites and some subscription services have two different types of licenses, standard and extended. For the most part, standard is probably fine. But if you're going to be distributing whatever it is that you're working on to millions and millions and millions of people, then you may want to look into the extended license. But for the most part, I found that standard is probably good. But as long as you're licensing them, definitely check with a lawyer. Of course, I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert. Definitely check, but for the most part, that's the point of licensing stock images, is that you're able to use them for commercial purposes, which you might be doing. All right, so we've got this container up at the top looking pretty good. And just to kick things off, we might want to grab our text tool and type out something like recent messages. I am going to left align it. There we go. So someone's asking, please arrange a class for your students' problems they face during designing. It's an interesting idea. It opens up a whole can of worms about, these live streams, and it's never enjoyable to deal with quote unquote problems for an hour or 2 hours or whatever it might be. I try to answer some questions during these masterclasses as much as I can, but a lot of times problems come down to technical support, and I'm just not equipped to deal with that. So the best bet is just, get in touch with support if it is a technical support question. But for things like UI design questions and things like that, I'm more than happy to answer them in these classes. All right, so we have our header, and I might want to bump this up so it's nice and readable. Ooh, that's a little bit too large probably. Let's try 24. There we go. All right. Someone's asking, something component doesn't work when I edit the main component. Any suggestions? So in that case, if you are editing the main component, which again is the one with the solid green diamond at the top left, make sure that your instances were not overridden or completely unlinked, right? If they were overridden, then certain properties will not update because you manually overrode. Now on the instances, you can go ahead and right click, and if you did make changes to it, you can revert it back to the main component. But yeah, just check that. Could be a million things though. All right, so we have recent messages, and we may want a way to maybe cycle to a different folder, for example. So I'm gonna grab the pen tool and draw out a very quick arrow. Nothing too crazy. And I activated the square grid with Command and Control apostrophe. Round these out, possibly, maybe, we'll see. And then I'm gonna thicken this up a little bit. That looks okay. I think that could work. All right, so I think the question about subscription is, could I still use them even if my subscription is no longer active? I believe so. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but the way most subscriptions for stock services work is that you generate the license once you license it, right? I believe. Again, don't quote me on this because I don't know for sure, but that's usually how it works. So yeah, look into that though. All right, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. Oops. There we go. And we've got recent messages. We have our little arrow. Put this over a little bit. And that could do. And then finally, we may want to just extend this outwards a little bit. And then over to the right, we may want a very quick way to compose a new message. So for here, I'm gonna grab my rectangle one more time. Make sure this is centered. To keep consistency, we're gonna round out the corners a little bit. And then on the inside, we may want a very simple compose. Let's say compose. Do we have any here? No. Right, maybe? No. Pen. Aha, I think we found some. Let's see, which one could work? We have so many icons to choose from. This one looks pretty good, possibly. I might want a solid version of that icon instead. Oh, this one's kind of fancy. In this case, we may not even need that border in the background or that shape in the background, so I can delete this. And then bring this down and do something like that. Keep it simple, right? Perfect. All right. So someone's saying Figma is better than Adobe XD ? That's a personal preference, right? There are so many different applications out there, and they do very different things. In my case, I love XD just because how simple it is, and also the prototyping features. I'm big into prototyping, and I have used all the applications out there, and I personally prefer Adobe XD. Many people in the chat prefer XD. It all comes down to what you and your team needs, right? I'm never going to tell you that you have to use XD or you cannot use something else, right? Use all of them, enjoy them, experiment, and see what your team likes and what they don't like. But yeah, all comes down to personal preference. The lovely thing about the industry that we're in is there are so many amazing applications out there for you to choose from, and not just one, right? So knock yourself out, have fun with all of them, and yeah, enjoy it. Recent, and this one will be compose. That looks pretty good. And this is going to be the header. So I'm going to grab all of these, group them, and call this header. There we go. All right, perfect. Let's see, those masterclasses are so much smoother at 1x speed. Oh yes, yeah, a lot of people watch the replays at like 2x speed, which, hey, it's fast, but yeah, I talk fast as it is. All right, so here we go. So right down here, now that we have our header in place, we may want to start adding in some messages. So I'm going to grab the rectangle one more time. And again, like everything could be created with a rectangle. So I'm going to drag one out like this. And I'm not too worried about the size at the moment because we're going to be adding padding very shortly. And for the shape, we're going to actually go ahead and round this out a little bit. Let's try 8 pixels just to keep it nice and simple. And we may not need a border, but we're going to add a little bit of a shadow, right? So we're going to do this. Again, we're going to add a little bit of blue in there. We're going to bump it down a touch. We're going to blur it quite a bit. Maybe even, let's say, 32 again. Not bad. Again, I'm not worried about the size of this particular container because it's going to enlarge as we start adding in some content, but just so you can see what it's going to look like somewhere right around here, right? Now, on the inside, we may want some information. You may want the user's avatar, whether they're online or offline, the name, for example, and possibly a preview of that message. No signal from my camera. Oh no. Well, that's awkward. All right, well, I'll have to look into that. Is it plugged in? I think it's plugged in. My face is gone. Okay, so I'm going to pop off the camera just for, hold on, let's find the camera. There's my camera. I'm gonna turn it off and I'll figure that out. Sometimes for whatever reason, it just disappears. I don't know, it looks like it's plugged in, right? Yeah, it's plugged in, I don't know. I'll figure that out for the next class. But what I'm gonna do now is start with the avatar. So I'm gonna grab the rectangle one more time, drag one out. Let's see if that looks like a pretty good size, right? Round at the corners a touch, ever so slightly. Let's go for 16 pixels. Again, we're going to be using padding shortly, but just to kind of eyeball it. And then we can start adding in some avatars. Boop, there we go. Signal's gone. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. And then over top of the avatar, like I mentioned, we may want a very quick way to know if the user is online or offline. So I'm going to grab the ellipse tool this time. Of course, you can use a rectangle for this, but just drag one out like this. Move it down a touch. And then for this one, this user might be online. So I'm going to change the color to green. And maybe I'll set the border to white, just so it gives a little bit of a knockout effect right there, right? Perfect. Now, over to the right, we may want to start adding in some more information about this person. So this might be Maria. Change the color to a nice darker color. Let's say Maria H. Make this quite a bit smaller. Just like that. And then over to the right of this, we may want to also show the time that this particular message came in. So I'm going to duplicate this over to the right. I'm going to hold down Alt-Option and drag. And maybe let's say 3:23 p.m. Now, this is secondary information, so I'm going to drop the weight just a little bit. I'm also going to drop the opacity a touch to around, let's say, 60%, right? I'm going to position it over beside this text. Now, one other benefit of using stacks and padding is for situations like this, right? We have this text layer, which contains this user's name, and we have this text layer over to the side. If we were to dive in here and change this to, let's say Maria Howard, right? This text layer does not push over, so I would have to manually move that over. But what we can do is we can select both of these layers, pop them into a group, Command and Control G. I'm going to call this user name, and then I'm going to turn a stack on within the Properties Inspector. And that way I can dive in here now, and as I make that change, it's automatically going to shift that layer over to the right, which is great. All right, this looks a little bit too small, I think. So I'm going to bump this up. Oh, that's way too small. Let's try 16. That looks a little bit better. And that's definitely one of the advantages of checking out that preview for ever so often, right? You can kind of see what things are looking like in a zoomed out view, whereas if you were zoomed in like I am now, everything looks great, but in reality, it's very small. Let's see what 16 looks like for the border. That's not too bad. It has a fun little style, right? All right, there we go. And then finally, we may want the message from this user. So I'm going to grab the text tool now. Instead of clicking, I'm going to click and drag like this. And here we can start typing out our message. Currently watching your Masterclass and the camera went out. Fix it, right? Now, because this is the message, you might want to make a few changes to this. Maybe drop the size just a little bit. Maybe we'll change the weight to about book, possibly, right? And if we take a quick look, it's not looking too bad. And one thing I do want to do is also hop into my assets and make sure that I am adding these as character styles, right? So I have this right here. I might want to add this as a character style, and I can name this username message possibly. And then this one here, I'm going to add this as well, user message, maybe preview, right? So once I do get to the point where I have many of these message cards going down the artboard and possibly on other artboards, I can just edit this once and it'll, push out to everywhere else. Now, I did mention padding a little bit earlier. So what I want to do now is select all this information, including this background card, right? And pop this all into a group, which I can call message card. And then over within the Properties Inspector, I'm going to turn padding on one more time. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it automatically defines that padding based on the contents inside of it. So right here at the bottom, it's defined it as 87 pixels at the bottom because that's how many pixels were down there, right? So I may want to change that to about 16, right? So now I have this nice little card that squeezes on in to the individual message. And I may want to maybe give a little bit more padding down there. Let's say 32. All right. So we have our first card in place, looking pretty good, but we may want a few additional ones. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I have this first message card selected. I'm going to put this one into another group, Command and Control G, and call this messages. And now, just like with the users, I can turn on the stack. Oh, don't forget the, oopsie. Thank you, Andy. I forgot the ellipse. View. And right there. Perfect. All right, that looks pretty good. And now with this overall group selected, I'm going to turn a stack on. Now, in this case, it defined it as a horizontal stack because inside of this group, there's only one object right now, or at least grouped, right? If these were not grouped, then it might define it something differently. So I'm going to switch it over to vertical. And now with this group selected, I can duplicate and duplicate and duplicate, right? And now I have additional cards going down the artboard, right? And I can swap them around as needed. So let's go ahead and make some quick changes. I'm going to just change this to, let's say, I'm going to use some names in the chat. Andy W. Maybe this will be a few minutes later. And let's grab an avatar. Whoops. Toy faces. And let's grab this avatar here. Pop that in there. And let's see, what do we want to change this to? Big thanks to Howard for today's masterclass. It was awesome, and I learned so much, right? Sorry for putting words in your mouth, Andy, but what I wanted to show is once you get to that next line and it bumped down, it also bumped down all the messages below it, right? So if I were to maybe just delete all of this, it's gonna bump those down too, right? Which is really nice. All right, let's do another one. We've got Fabian in here. And Fabian S. We'll change this to 30. Grab another avatar. Boop. Great stream today. And then finally, we've got Umacorn and B. And maybe this will be at 4 o'clock, right? Whoops, 4 o'clock. And then finally, avatar, right? And I can also dive in here and change this. Maybe Umacorn is not online or she's busy. I can change this to a pink color, right? Or pinkish red. And there we go. Now I'm gonna go ahead and just make some changes to this. I'm gonna maybe space this out a little bit. Let's try 24 pixels. So there's a nice amount of breathing room in there. And just to show you, just a little sneak peek into next week possibly, is once we start adding in some additional cards, right? I'm gonna just duplicate these going down, is we can start introducing things like scroll groups. So I have a bunch going down this panel, right? And I have this entire messages group selected. Now over to the right, I can turn on a vertical scroll group and then adjust the handles. That one looks pretty good down there. And now if I press play, I can scroll down, right? Now, what you're gonna notice is down here at the bottom, because we are using rounded corners for that container in the background, you know, we have this little overlap. So there are a few ways that we can tackle this. We might tackle this in the next episode, but very quickly, we can grab this container, we can duplicate it, for example, and we can actually use this as a mask. I'll talk more about this next time, but we can do that, and that way it contains it really nicely inside of that shape, right? So now we can scroll and we don't have that issue with that card, right? Which is wonderful. Now that's a lot of Fabians in there. So I'm just gonna delete some of these. And again, we're gonna talk more about some of this stuff in the next episode, next week. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now, of course, you know, depending on what content you're gonna be adding, depending on your workflow, you can also, you know, create some of these cards as components as well. You know, I could have done that from the beginning, but I chose not to. But you certainly can, right? So next week, what we're going to start doing is we're going to start, you know, adding some additional content over here to the right, and things like a search experience, some of the channel messages, right? And let's go ahead and round out these corners. Let's say 32 pixels, just like we did earlier, 32 and 32. I'm going to grab these, bring that out. Bring this out as well. Perfect. And you know, these rounded corners obviously are completely optional. If you don't like the rounded corners, you can just pull them back in, just like that. And you can round out the corners on the right-hand side as well. Completely up to you. Let's go ahead and grab the messages. We can make those longer if you wanted to. And you're probably noticing, right, that some of the text layers are kind of staggering a little bit. And that's going back to what we were talking about earlier about the manual constraints, right? So you can dive in here and switch this over to manual, make sure it is you know, hooked onto the left-hand side. Same thing with this one. And you'll have to do the same thing with, you know, the other cards as well. But that will allow, as you're moving it, you're noticing the first one is kind of staying put, right? Is Toy Faces a plugin? So not at the moment, but the artist did confirm that a plugin is in the works. So stay tuned for that. It should be a lot of fun. So I'll just dive in quickly and make sure to align these to the left. go. And if you used components, for example, it'd be much easier, but let's grab our messages. So if you needed to, you can always, pull them on out and make them larger, make them smaller. Completely up to you, but it's looking pretty good, right? All right, so very quickly before we wrap up, actually we're about to wrap up. I'm gonna turn my camera on again, or at least try to restart it, see if I can just wrap things up for all of you. Let's see if that works. It may not. I don't know what's going on with my camera. Let's see. Aha, there we go. Okay, it's possible the battery died even though it's plugged in, I think. Or maybe it's not plugged in, I don't know. But that is going to wrap it up for today's Masterclass. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in today. I will be back next week with Masterclass number 51. We're going to continue this process, build out some additional elements, and then eventually we're going to convert this thing into a nice dark mode experience. So big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I will see you all next time. Stick around. Kyle T. Webster's coming up in just a few minutes with his illustration Masterclass. Thanks, everyone.